the new branch of WA Newspapers, which was TVW Limited, and there we set about thinking about news and how we were going to do it. And that still photograph which you've got, which shows a number of us doing a recording at WA Newspapers in the photographic section at the back of WA Newspapers, is what I describe as the birth of television news. We had a projector, and we had a Bayer wild tape, and we had literally a gramophone and several discs. And we had David Farr doing a recording. There was no soundproofing. We just asked everyone in the building to keep quiet. And we had Jim Healy and Dig Milner and Tom Hall and myself. And I would cue David Farr when to start talking. And in fact, here is a replica of, or a print of that picture, which you'll no doubt show in full screen, Ken, when you do this recording. Now, what we would do, we would then, having recorded the newsreel, which was a combination of some material being shot locally and processed in a very crude but brilliant way by Tom Hall, and we had other newsreel material we got from various other organisations. We'd record it on the wild tape and take it up to the transmitter at Bickley, and then we'd play it. Now, this worked effectively 2 or 3 times. First newsreels ever shown live on television during the trade transmissions in WA. And as we were progressing towards October the 16th, we got a little bit more ambitious, and Jim Crothers and Brian Treaser said maybe you could do a longer version of this, and we'll show it in about a month, I think, before we actually went officially to air. So we did another one, and we took it up there, and we were quite chuffed what outstanding television geniuses we were to have done this marvellous work. And we rolled the telecine, and off the program went, and suddenly everything went wrong. What we had not thought about, no one had. Of course, this was unlocked Bayer tape, and the weather had become warmer. It was very warm, the transmitter, and the tape stretched and it got out of sync. So this was going along. We were, by the end of the program, we would have been 7 or 8 minutes out of synchronisation. So you can imagine what a really great gaff that was, and to the guffaws of the public and anyone who knew anything about it. But anyway, that was a start, and it got us going. When we moved out to the studios itself, we were able to get into it in a proper way, using the Oricon sound on film track, and we had Araflex cameras, which was straight newsreel material, and 2 or 3 smaller cameras like the Palard Bolex and the Bell and Howell, and we were in full flight. Most of us went over to the eastern states and had a look at the 7 network, and indeed ultimately some of the 9s as well, to learn more about it and see news in action behind the scenes. Now, one thing we were very particular about was making sure we wrote the copy for the spoken word. This is the one thing I learned in London, the difference between the spoken word and the written word. Now, 2 or 3 of our newsreaders, of course, who were wonderful radio announcers and wonderful presenters, but were pretty ordinary television newsreaders who never really caught on to news reading as the way it should have been. And some of them used the excuse that some of the writing was for the written word and not for the spoken word. It's totally untrue. And we had a few stand-up brawls, verbally, I should say, over these matters.
First news editor at TVW was Darcy Farrell. He directed the news, reporting with great distinction over many years.
A fire engine siren or an ambulance horn, they'd chase it.
Darcy Farrell, one of the top newsmen of the day.
Absolutely. Darcy's the best newsman I've seen around for a long time. Very good indeed.
I didn't start there until May of 1961, but it was still part of the early crop. But ahead of me were people like Lloyd Lawson, David Farr, Jeff Walker, Vin Walsh doing the weather, and then a bit later on there were the 2 Garys, myself and Gary Meadows.
Yes.
I think that you'll find Gary Carville at the age of 18 was an understudy to Gary Meadows. Greg Pearce, of course, cut his teeth reading news at Channel 7. But I think probably two for their outstanding talent from a producer's point of view were Gary Meadows and Peter Waltham. In Meadows' case, he had a photographic memory and we didn't have auto cues, or idiot sheets as they were known, and the people reading bulletins and presenters were called talking heads. Some of them were more intelligent than that, I'm pleased to say. But Meadows had a wonderful memory and he could memorise a page and go through it very successfully, and with a quick glance he'd pre-read everything, of course, and he was quite outstanding. You could throw Meadows onto a 30-minute bulletin without any rehearsal whatsoever, and you'd think he'd been practising it for a week. Waltham, very, very, very good, simply because he could hold a bulletin together. You're always going to have technical problems that sooner or later, whether the film breaks or whether tape doesn't work, or whatever it might be. Well, Waltham knew exactly what to do. He could go to the standby material and keep it going for as long as you would need him to.
Included in the interview are Peter Cook and Gordon Masters, who's the Minister here for Labour and Industry. Will I keep talking? What would you like me to talk about? I can talk about anything.
In fact, during things like the Apollo program, which also we played an active part in, Waltham was terrific at filling, what we call filling, stretching, just talking and talking and talking, and he was terrific at it. Lloyd Lawson had a lovely voice, a very resonant, mellifluous voice. Of course, we've gone on to see some wonderful people. I think Susanna Carr has a fabulous voice, and I think that Rick Arden is probably one of the most popular, simply because he's not only a good reader, but he has a great appealing presence on camera.
Jocelyn Treasure has reminded us of the loss of TVW cine cameraman Keith Digby Milner in 1960. Channel 7 had been operational for little more than a year when this family man and much valued member of the staff was taken from them. A little earlier in the year, from August the 25th to September the 11th, 1960, TVW was the only television station in Australia to send a team to the Summer Olympics in Rome.
We sent Dig Milner, and Sid Donovan and Doug Burton went from the West. He was the head photographer at the West, and they did some remarkable stuff.
Our camera unit hopes to bring you a day-by-day film coverage and interviews with the leading Australians. Now meet the TVW team who will be bringing you Olympic Report. Here's Doug Burton, head photographer from West Australian newspapers, who will be doing some of the camera work and interviewing a number of the athletes. And here's Keith Milner, the all-important cameraman, who will be shooting some thousands of feet of film during the Games to ensure a first-rate coverage. Well, Keith, everything looks set first-rate for a wonderful Olympic Games here in Rome.
It certainly does, Sid. The city seems to be teeming with people, and many visitors are coming in on aircraft every day. Our athletes seem to be in top form, and I think we should have a lot of good luck.
And what are your impressions of the facilities provided here in Rome, Doug?
Well, I think they're extra good, Sid. Having been to Melbourne in 1956, I feel that the Italians have something comparable to, if not better than, the Australians' effort in 1956.
All our footage from those games was used across Australia, so it was remarkably successful, saddened a couple of months later by Dig Milner's death in an air crash north of Perth at Cervantes, when Dig and Owie Williams from the West both got killed. And Alan McIntosh, the young cadet journalist, survived, and he went on to become an outstanding journalist for WA newspapers.
Politicians often came to Perth to give us their political message and to ask for our vote. One of them was Bob Menzies. Darcy again.
Menzies was an overpowering personality, absolutely overpowering. If the interviewers today, he'd never be able to do today what he did in those ways, and the ways he dominated the media. He would dominate anyone. He was superb intellect, stronger, better than anyone we've probably had in terms of his presence. A world figure, if he had wanted to be. In Forest Place, we did a couple of election outside broadcasts where Menzies nearing the end of his career, by the way. A man in his 70s still could hold an audience. The crowd would pack down. 10,000 people would pack into Forest Place just to hear Menzies, and the way he would bounce off the interjectors just had to be seen to be believed. And he could destroy any interjector or even groups of interjectors.
To think that although you poor simple people have been voting for me for 15 years...
Robert Menzies was one of the world's great orators.
You've been voting for an utter fraud.
There were always people prepared to interject at Menzies, but they did it at their own risk.
Chap down here, clever fella, very clever chap. And who caused all this trouble with Malaysia and Indonesia? I said, well, I suppose I did. My name must be Sukarno.
To finish the news each night was, of course, the weather. Do you remember Jim Rings Bees given by TV weatherman Zen Walsh? Then, of course, there were the first of many girls to take up the weather chart pointer. Here's one I'm sure you'll remember, Children's Channel 7 hostess Trina Brown.
How did I get my wink, for instance? That was, you didn't get called to Mr. Treasurer's office unless you were in trouble. And one morning, I did the weather the first night, and I really had to prove that I could do it. And it didn't seem the way in those days to tell you you'd done a good job. It was if you hadn't. So the next morning, I had a memo on my desk to go to Brian Treasurer's office. And when I got there, I walked in and he said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." He said, "Did you wink on television last night?" Now, it's something I have done all my life. I just say, "G'day," and the wink comes. And I said, "I don't know, Mr. Treasurer." He said, "Well, you did, and you will from this night on, because the switchboard lit up." And so that's how, and then, of course, I was nervous, thinking, did I wink? But that's how it happened. So it wasn't anything contrived, it was just a natural happening.
In 1958, the City of Perth lodged an application with the Australian British Empire and Commonwealth Games Association to host the 7th Games in 1962. TVW Channel 7 also needed an outside broadcast van, so rather than purchase one, TVW engineer John Quick was tasked with designing and building one, which he achieved with the assistance of Bert King. John also was responsible for the design and acquisition of a camera dolly, which was often called the pram. A most handy device used for a wide range of outside broadcasts, and also at times employed by a film crew. John O'Callaghan was the supervising technician, whilst Alan Bateman was the senior technician on the van at Perry Lakes. TVW's inaugural news editor Darcy Farrell was not only pivotal to Seven's planning and preparations, but he was also the director in the OB van who coordinated the opening ceremony telecast for Seven. It was a busy time for news as the space race was underway and Perth was beginning to grow from a small town to a large metropolis. This resulted in associated growing pains, which were also manifest in a terrifying crime wave that held everyone in the grip of a mysterious serial killer who randomly picked on Perth households at night.
A mystery gunman shot 2 people dead in Vincent and Louise Streets, Nedlands.
I don't think we've seen the city before or since gripped in such a way.
A 3rd man was critically wounded and the gunman fired upon 2 other people sitting in a parked car.
I think it was a fear born of utter helplessness because people just didn't know where this killer was.
The gunman vanished into the night as mysteriously as he had arrived. He left few clues.
I know of stories of people actually crawling to the door and peeking out through the window. It was genuinely a very, very frightening period.
During the Cook era, there also occurred another event which we won an award for. We called it Manhunt, and that was the case of Brian William Robinson shooting several people, including a policeman, escaped into the Nangara pine plantation, and he was there for more than 24 hours before he was hunted down. and we sent reporter Bob Cribb, who died recently, and Bob went into the Nankara forest with a small rigged up OB unit which we had.
A TVW mobile van and RAAF vehicles were pressed into service to help floodlight the long lanes running through the forest.
23-year-old Brian William Robinson was hanged at Fremantle Jail on January 1964. 9 months later, serial killer Eric Edgar Cook became the last person hanged in WA.
The drama has ended. Phase 2 of the great crime wave of 63 is over.
The great addresses of all time. Just hold your camera there. In fact, I happened to dig out this old television magazine which told about, and you can take this with you probably, Ken, which actually told of the television's great moments on the assassination of Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. Now, one of the interesting things in that when Kennedy did die, that's a telex that went around the world honouring Kennedy. And it says in on the bottom, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. It's one of many great tributes to him, but I'll just put that down. The death of Kennedy, certainly it was said that it was the making of television in the United States, and it certainly was the making of television here.
10 minutes before noon, the motorcade begins the 11-mile ride to the Dallas trademark, where the president is to deliver a major
motorcade route. Something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. Stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
When you watch the film, as he panned with the car from left to right, he almost lost the president at the bottom of the frame. And finally he gets the camera pointed down so you can actually see him. Just an amazing film. And
well, Sir James, some of the originals, there's one more of course, and it's Ken Alexander. And I call on Ken now to make the presentation on behalf of the entire staff of TVW Channel 7 to you, Sir James. To do it, Mr. Ken Alexander.
When you saw some of the films there this evening, one particular piece came to mind, and that was something very few people here probably know, that Sir James once walked to Geraldton. I think he had the money for the fare, but it all started, if I remember, down in the old Studio 3 or 4 at the Barleycorn Hotel. I've forgotten now whether it was 3 or 4. And a silly little discussion started about walking to Geraldton and how long it would take. Darcy Farrell was another person in this, and it developed that certain bets were placed about how long it would take to walk to Geraldton. When I came to work after the weekend again, I remember a young fellow that worked in the newsroom, Bill McCartney, who was about 17 then. And Bill came racing into the news editing room and said to me, "For Christ's sake," he said, "I've been conned to walk to Geraldton." Bill's prowess as an athlete, I think at that stage of the game, was sitting on a rock at Rottnest demolishing a couple of stubbies. But whilst all this was going on, Sir James was doing his practice round the parks for this long walk ahead. And about Tuesday during the week, things looked a bit serious about this walk to Geraldton. So every time I walked past Darcy Farrell, I very smartly said, "Gee, Darcy, I've got a stone bruise on the foot." I was a little bit worried that I might be conned. And Campy again, I think he developed a pull muscle, and Mossy had water on the knee or something. We had to do something to get out of it, but whilst this was going on, Sir James was getting the practice for the walk to Geraldton. They did the trip, what, in about 4 days, wasn't it? About 13, was it? Oh, I was slower than I thought. But One chap that did it a little quicker, I think, was Darcy Farrell, Darcy Biso. He always gets the easy jobs. He was the one that had the Land Rover to go and lay the food supplies along the run. And of course he arrived at Geraldton before all of them.
TVW7 had a link with the American space program pretty well from the beginning. The world had started to become accustomed to space activities. I remember I was sailing down the Persian Gulf in 1956 when Sputnik was going over. Of course, the Russians gained the lead very quickly with Sputnik, and then ultimately next was the placing of Laika, the dog, in space. I think it's since been revealed that, in fact, the Russian space engineer, whose name escapes me, was miles ahead. He had very little money to work with, but he was an absolute genius, and he was certainly, I think, probably ahead of von Braun, with the backing of the American dollar and John F. Kennedy pledging to put a man on the moon before the end of the 60s.
This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It's just scientific wonder. It was Buck Rogers and Star Trek all rolled into one.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Within the decade, which would have taken into the early 70s, the Americans gradually overhauled the Russians, starting with the Mercury project.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you, and I consider it a very real honor, gentlemen. From your right, Malcolm S. Carpenter, Leroy G. Cooper, John H. Glenn, Virgil I. Grissom, Walter M. Shira, Alan B. Shepard, Donald K. Slayton. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
Ship 7, this is Mutual Contact, Deary, over.
Hello, Mutual Contact, this is Friendship 7, reading you loud and clear.
And on the occasion when John Glenn was going to girdle the Earth,
Godspeed, John Glenn.
we had Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, at Mutual as the command communicator.
Who'd be talking to Glenn from Mutual, which was just north of Pierce RAF base, which of course was a command station. So Cooper spoke to Glenn, and became a very big PR exercise because at a press conference, Cooper was asked whether the astronaut would be able to see the lights of the city, and he said, yeah. He said, it's irrelevant, but he will be able to. Now, interestingly enough, prior to that press conference, Brian Treasure had said to me, he said, had I seen a previous, I think it was a Rod Serling Twilight Zone or something similar, and I think Lee Marvin starred in it. It was just called Marooned. It's on Channel 7, and it was about a astronaut played by Marvin, who was marooned in space, and the Americans worked out a method of signalling to him, because his communications were cut, with each city sending, by switching the lights on and off, sending a message to him. Well, Treasure thought maybe the astronaut could see the lights of Perth, and Cooper confirmed that he could. But to my discredit and everyone else's, we didn't think much of it, because Cooper said, I don't think it's important. But Bill King, who worked for WA newspapers, he kept pursuing it, and he was the city roundsman, and he convinced Lord Mayor Howard, who was reluctant to have the lights switched on because he said it would waste power, but he convinced Harry Howard to change his mind and encourage people to switch the lights on. They did switch them on as Friendship 7 went over, Cooper said, "Can you?" knew he picked up on the PR benefit for this program, and he said, "Can you see the lights?" And he said, "Yes, I do see the lights."
I can see the outline of the town and a very bright light just to the south of it. Roger, that's Perth and Rockingham you're saying there.
Of course, this gave Perth world headlines, even greater headlines, much more coverage than the Commonwealth Games, because the Americans picked up on it, and then the Oklahoma Gas and Light Company put a full-page ad in the West thanking the people of Perth for putting on the lights for Glenn. Subsequently, we had the chief astronaut, Donald Kent Slayton, came to Perth. I did a half-hour program with him. We had just about all of the Mercury 7 came to Perth, and then of course the space station was shifted to Carnarvon, and during that period we received our first ever satellite news program from ITN in London. It was all very furry and fuzzy. Anyway, it didn't work, but we still put it to air. The sound was good. Pictures were pretty fuzzy. So when the man on the moon actually occurred, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, those pictures were fuzzy, but by then people had seen the previous stuff that all satellite pictures are fuzzy. So, but the moon landing was, of course, one of the 3 or 4 great events of the century, I guess, or in the top 10. And we played that pretty well all day, and we had Waltham on air with stock photographs with models of the rockets and models of the lunar landing module, and it became one of the highlights of the 50 years of Channel 7. There's no question about that. Now, I don't want to rate that with things like the Twin Towers, because in those days that I'm talking about, in the 60s and the 70s, you had all sorts of restrictions on what vision you could put to air. The Broadcasting Control Board said the engineering standards had to be observed, so you couldn't go around with your mobile phone, not that we had them, and take pictures and expect them to put them to air. The engineers would veto that because it wasn't up to standard. And of course today, just as you had at the Twin Towers, lots of people with their cameras took marvellous pictures. That indeed is probably the most spectacular vision since World War II, and probably in peacetime the most spectacular vision since the dirigible blew up at New Jersey in the 1930s. So Man on the Moon was a different story, and of course it ushered in a whole new era. And everyone now takes space for granted, as they did also when Apollo 13 ran into trouble and very nearly didn't get back. So the space program, and when you look at it, it's covered now the best part of 50 years. It's been a remarkable achievement by the Americans.
Perth stopped. The whole town stopped stone dead.
I'm going to step off the limb now.
It just was a stunning historic event.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That was the event which Perth will never ever forget.
And I think people look back in history and see that as the sensational event of one of the most sensational events spanning on television here of the whole 50 years of Channel 7.
Okay, here we go. I know. Darcy, why aren't you in it?
I don't know.
Come on,
Darcy.
He's waiting for the invitation.
Yeah, now we've got a full photograph.
Overall, great talent.
Yeah?
All great talents.
Okay. All right, guys. What's it like being back on the desk here?
It's great. I can't understand why I'm still not here. Something's wrong with them. They going Tropo. I saw Jim Carruthers out there. I said, "What about a job?" He said, "You never worked when you were here."
David, things look a bit different to how they might have.
Fun. But I'm glad I'm not in it any longer.
Why?
I couldn't stand the pace. It's so much fun being retired.
Is it?
Yes, it is. It is.
Does the studio feel different? I mean,
No, this is exactly the studio that we first worked from when we went to air in '59.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Control room up there.
Gallop down those stairs from the control room, and still the shadow of it is there now, isn't it?
Yes.
But we used to
Yes,
hurtle
it
down
is.
there because Darcy would always keep writing news until 6:35. We'd gone to air at 6:30. and you'd have it passed to you. Remember that?
Yes,
You'd have it
yes,
passed to
yes,
you
yes.
as you were
Not all
going.
around
You know.
the bridge,
And I'll never forget one night coming in when we had a very narrow news desk, and I hurtled down with about 38 pages of news and went dong dong to knock it up, and it all went chum on that side of the desk. And there was the floor manager picking it up and finding page 16, page 17. Oh.
That was a good night. We had it numbered.
Absolutely right.